It was the summer of 2019 when I first got sucked into this weird and terrifying experience. I had just turned 18, living in a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. Like most teenagers, I spent a lot of my time gaming. I had a decent setup at home, but my console, an old PlayStation 4, was starting to show its age. It would freeze at random times, the graphics would glitch out, and sometimes it wouldn't even start up at all. So I started saving up money to get a newer model. One evening, I was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace when I saw an ad for a PlayStation 5. Now, I knew the PS5 was new and super popular, so I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the price. It was listed for $300. Normally, these things were going for over $500, sometimes even more, so $300 seemed like a steal. I immediately messaged the seller, a guy named Jason, asking if it was still available. He replied almost instantly, "Yeah, still got it. I'm selling it cheap because I'm moving and need to get rid of some stuff fast. If you're serious, I can meet you today." I was skeptical at first. It was almost too good to be true. But the thought of scoring a new console for a fraction of the price was too tempting. So I asked for a meeting place. Jason replied with a location I didn't recognize. A parking lot at the edge of town, near a small shopping center. It seemed a little off to me, but I figured it was a busy area and there would probably be other people around. I just needed to get the console and get out of there. Jason gave me a quick rundown of the details. We would meet at 7 p.m., and he said he would bring the PS5 in a box. I confirmed and made sure he knew I had cash, just to make everything clear. That night, I got in my car, drove over, and arrived a little early, just to be safe. The parking lot was mostly empty, with just a few cars scattered here and there. It wasn't as busy as I expected, but I figured that was normal for a weekday evening. I waited for about 20 minutes, but there was no sign of Jason. I shot him a text, but there was no reply. I checked my phone again, and the time was ticking down. I was getting anxious, but tried to stay calm. Maybe he was just running late or having trouble with traffic. Another 15 minutes passed, and I was starting to get a bad feeling. I figured I'd give it a bit longer, but then something weird happened. I opened my GPS app to check the address just to make sure I was in the right spot, and my phone started acting strange. The map shifted suddenly. The location I had marked as the meeting place was now showing a completely different spot, way out in the desert and about 20 minutes north of where I was. It was an isolated area with nothing around for miles. I thought my phone was glitching, so I closed the app and opened it again, but the same thing happened. The GPS kept redirecting me to this remote location. I had no idea what was going on, but now I was freaking out. I texted Jason again asking what was happening, but still no response. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. At that point, I was seriously considering just leaving and writing it off as a scam. But something made me keep going. Maybe it was the curiosity, maybe the hope that I would still get the PS5 for such a low price, or maybe I was just being stupid. I don't know. But I followed the directions my phone was giving me, just to see where it would take me. I drove through some dark streets and eventually found myself heading into the outskirts of the city. The roads started getting narrower and there were fewer houses. Soon, there were only large fields on either side of me, with nothing but the occasional streetlight flickering in the distance. My heart was racing now, and I could feel a cold sweat running down my back. This was starting to feel more and more like a setup. When I pulled up to the new location, I couldn't believe what I saw. The area was completely deserted. There were no other cars, no lights, nothing. Just an old, run-down warehouse at the end of a dirt road. I parked my car, heart pounding in my chest, and sat there frozen for a few moments. This was definitely not where I had planned to meet Jason. But before I could even think about what to do next, something caught my eye. There was a car parked across the lot, near the back of the warehouse. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. The engine was running, and I could barely make out the shape of a person sitting in the driver's seat, but I couldn't tell who it was. I felt like I was being watched, and every instinct in me screamed to leave, to drive away. But I couldn't shake the idea that something was horribly wrong. I started to slowly reverse my car, but just as I was about to pull away, I saw someone standing by the warehouse. A man, about 6 feet tall, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, his face obscured by the shadows. He raised his hand as if to wave me down, but something about his posture made it clear he wasn't waving. It felt like a signal, like a trap was being set. That's when everything clicked. I wasn't meeting someone for a PlayStation 5. I had walked into a situation where I was the target, and I had no idea how deep I was in. This was a human trafficking operation, and I had nearly walked straight into it. I slammed my car into drive and sped out of there, not even caring if I was breaking any traffic laws. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was about to burst. I didn't even look back until I was miles away, still driving with shaky hands and a racing mind. The whole time, I was convinced that someone was following me, but when I finally reached a well-lit area with other cars around, I dared to take a breath. When I got home, I locked all the doors and didn't move from my couch for hours. My mind kept replaying the whole thing. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily I could have fallen into their trap. But the scariest part, I later realized that Jason was never the seller. It wasn't about the money. They had been tracking me the whole time through my phone, and they had set up that entire fake listing to get me to the right place. That was the last time I ever used Facebook Marketplace for anything. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever trust online buying the same way again. I learned the hard way that some deals really are too good to be true. If you ever come across an offer that seems suspiciously cheap or ask you to meet in some random out-of-the-way place, trust your gut. There are people out there who will do anything to get you to a vulnerable spot. And always, always, double-check the location before you go. It all started a couple of years ago when I was living in Denver, Colorado. I had just moved into a new apartment, a cute little place in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. The apartment was cozy, with hardwood floors and a vintage vibe that I really loved, but there was one thing that bothered me: the giant old mirror hanging in the living room. It wasn't just any mirror, it was massive, maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. It looked like something you'd find in an old mansion, with a gold ornate frame that looked like it belonged in a museum. I don't know what it was about it, but every time I looked at it, I felt uneasy. Like something about it didn't belong there, like it was holding a secret I didn't want to know. At first, I just tried to ignore it, but every time I walked past it, I got this chill down my spine. The mirror reflected the entire room, but there was something about the way it made the space look off. The angles didn't line up perfectly. I don't know if it was just the shape of the room or the way the light hit it, but it felt wrong. Eventually, I decided I had to get rid of it. It was too big, too heavy, and just didn't fit the vibe of my apartment. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or curses, but this mirror was starting to get to me. I decided to list it on Craigslist. I figured someone else might want it. I took a few pictures, described it as vintage and in good condition, and posted it with a price that seemed fair. The response came quickly. Within hours, I had a message from a guy named Tom who lived in Aurora, just outside of Denver. He said he'd been looking for a mirror like mine for months, and that he'd be happy to come pick it up that afternoon. I was a little cautious, but he seemed friendly enough. He said he was moving into a new house and wanted something classic to hang in his living room. We agreed to meet at my place around 3 p.m. He told me he'd bring a friend to help him carry it. When they showed up, I couldn't help but notice something weird. Tom was already standing by my front door, but he didn't look like I expected. He was tall, but thin, almost too thin. His eyes were wide, like he hadn't slept in days, and his face was pale. He didn't smile once, just sort of nodded when I greeted him. The guy he was with was quieter, but just as strange. They didn't shake my hand or introduce themselves. They just got straight to the mirror. I led them into the living room, and when Tom saw the mirror, his face lit up. I thought, okay, maybe this was the right guy for it. He was practically glowing when he looked at it. The other guy, though, just kept staring at the mirror, not saying a word. He looked uncomfortable, but Tom didn't seem to notice. As we moved the mirror, I could feel this weird tension building in the room. It wasn't like any normal transaction I'd ever had. The guys didn't talk much while they worked. Tom kept his focus entirely on the mirror, as if it was the most important thing in the world. When they finally loaded it into their car, a beat-up, rusty Chevy Malibu, I watched them drive off, still feeling weirdly uneasy. That night, everything seemed fine. I went to bed around 11 p.m., but around 2 a.m., I woke up to my phone buzzing. I looked at the screen, and it was a message from an unknown number. I didn't recognize the area code, so I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. The text was simple: "It's watching me." I figured it was some kind of prank, but as I started to fall back asleep, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message said, "It whispers at night." I felt a chill run through me, but I was too tired to really worry about it. The next few days, the messages kept coming. "I can't sleep," "It's here with me," and the worst one, "It wants to kill me." I wasn't sure if this was just some weird prank or what, but I was starting to get scared. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail every time. I Googled the number, but nothing came up. By the end of the week, the messages stopped, but by then, I had a bad feeling about it all. Then came the worst part. About a month after Tom picked up the mirror, I started noticing something strange. Every time I looked into my own bathroom mirror, I thought I saw someone behind me for a split second. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it happened again and again. Every time I looked into the bathroom mirror, I'd catch a glimpse of someone standing behind me, just out of my line of sight. I tried to shake it off, but it got worse. I was in my living room one afternoon, sitting on the couch when I looked over at the wall where the giant mirror used to be. My heart skipped a beat. I could have sworn I saw something move in the reflection, something dark and blurry. I quickly turned around, but nothing was there. I thought maybe I was losing it. I had no explanation for what was happening, but I couldn't stop thinking about Tom and that mirror. Was it possible that something had followed the mirror home with him? I know it sounds crazy, but after those texts and the weird stuff I'd been seeing, I couldn't shake the thought. A few weeks later, I got a weird voicemail from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was shaky, like someone who had been crying. It was Tom. He sounded out of breath, almost frantic. "Hey," he said. "I don't know what's happening, but it won't stop. It's following me. I don't know what it wants, but it won't leave me alone." Then there was a long pause, followed by something that made my blood run cold. I could hear a faint whispering in the background, like it was coming from far away. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was calling his name. Then the call abruptly ended. I haven't heard from Tom since. I tried searching for him online, but nothing came up. His Facebook page, which had been active before, was gone. His number was disconnected. It was like he had vanished. To this day, I don't know what happened to him, but I can't get rid of the feeling that whatever that thing was, it's still out there. Sometimes when I'm home alone and glance at my bathroom mirror, I swear I can see someone standing behind me in the reflection. It's always just for a second, but it's enough to make me feel like I'm being watched. I moved out of that apartment 6 months later. I couldn't stay there anymore. The new tenants didn't keep the mirror, so I assume it's gone. But the memory of that mirror, the way it made me feel, it hasn't left me, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe looking into a mirror again. It was one of those lazy weekends when my girlfriend Kate and I decided to scroll through Facebook Marketplace just for fun. We were living in a small apartment in downtown Tucson, Arizona, and had been talking about upgrading our living room furniture for a while. Our old couch had seen better days. It was worn out, saggy, and covered in mysterious stains that we were pretty sure were never coming out. So, when I came across a listing for a free couch, I couldn't believe my luck. The ad read, "Free couch, must pick up before midnight. Moving and can't take it with me. First come, first served." It had a picture of a basic but nice-looking couch. The color was a soft beige, and it didn't seem too worn. No stains, no visible damage. At first, I thought it might be a scam or some weird deal, but free stuff is free stuff, right? Kate was skeptical, but I was excited. I shot the seller a message, and within minutes, they responded, telling me the couch was available and that we could come pick it up that evening. The catch? They insisted it had to be picked up by midnight because they were moving out of state the next morning. I thought it was a little strange, but I figured we'd get there, grab the couch, and be back in time to binge watch some Netflix. We didn't think much of it. We arrived at the address just before 9 p.m. It was in a quiet residential area not far from downtown. The house was a small, nondescript place, nothing too special, just a regular suburban home. When we knocked on the door, a man in his late 30s answered. He was wearing a faded hoodie and jeans, and his expression was a little too calm for someone who was supposedly moving out in a rush. But he was polite enough, offering to help us load the couch into our truck. "Thanks for taking it off my hands," he said as he stepped aside. "I just want to get everything out of here tonight." I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder, almost like he was in a hurry. His house was empty. No furniture, no boxes, just bare walls. It seemed odd, but I didn't think much of it. He didn't seem threatening, just a little off. We moved the couch into our truck, and before we left, he handed us a piece of paper with a phone number, just in case we needed to reach him for anything. He said goodbye with a quick smile, and we drove off. As soon as we got home, Kate and I were excited to set up the couch. We both agreed it was a bit bigger than we expected, but it fit nicely in the living room. We sat on it for a few minutes, and everything seemed fine. But after a while, we both started to notice something. There was a strange smell coming from the couch. At first, it was subtle, like a musty odor, but as time passed, it grew stronger, more pungent. It wasn't like the usual smell you get from old furniture. It was worse, something foul. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the couch had just been sitting in a damp place for too long, but Kate wasn't having it. She pulled the cushions off, and we both took a deep breath, trying to locate the source. We didn't find anything on top of the cushions, but when we flipped the couch over, something caught my eye. There was a small, dark stain near the seams on the bottom. It didn't look like regular dirt, but something deeper. I grabbed a utility knife and carefully cut along the seam, hoping to find a spill or some old food stuck in the padding. But when I pulled back the fabric, my heart stopped. Inside the couch, hidden beneath layers of foam and stuffing, was something that no one should ever find. It was a human arm, limp and decayed, wrapped in a black plastic bag. My blood ran cold. I could hardly breathe. I looked over at Kate, and I could see the shock on her face, just as horrified as I was. The smell was unbearable now, a mixture of decay and something far worse. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I froze, not knowing what to do next. We didn't know if we should call the cops or run. But then, as if the universe was playing some sick joke, there was a knock at the door. I was too scared to move, but Kate answered it. Standing outside was the man who had sold us the couch. His face was different now. There was something about the way he stood that made my skin crawl. He wasn't smiling anymore. In fact, he looked nervous. He glanced behind him, as if making sure no one was watching, then he turned to Kate. "I forgot something important in the couch," he said, his voice shaky. "Can I come in?" Kate, shaking, looked over at me. I didn't know what to do. I was still holding the knife in my hand from when I cut open the couch. My mind was racing, and my gut was telling me to call the cops immediately. This was no ordinary mistake. This was deliberate. We had been tricked into bringing this man's horrifying secret into our home. As the man stepped closer to the door, something clicked. I suddenly realized what was happening. The free couch, the rush to get it picked up before midnight, he had been using these free listings on Facebook Marketplace to offload the bodies of his victims. We were just the latest in a string of unsuspecting buyers who had unknowingly taken home a piece of his grisly disposal plan. I shuddered at the thought. He hadn't been after money. He had been using the listings as a cover, luring people to his home to dispose of his crimes. I think you need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked at Kate, who had gone pale, and we both backed away from the door. The man's face twisted, and for the first time, I saw real panic in his eyes. He realized we knew what he had done. He reached out toward us, but before he could do anything, I grabbed my phone and hit 911, my fingers trembling. The operator picked up, and I quickly explained everything. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the man had already disappeared. They searched the area, but they couldn't find him. After a long investigation, the authorities found out that the man had been using free listings on Facebook Marketplace for months, preying on innocent people who thought they were getting a great deal on furniture. He had been involved in a string of disappearances, and the bodies he had hidden inside the furniture were his victims. It turned out that the arm we found was just one of several that had been stuffed into couches and chairs he'd given away. The police eventually caught him, and he was arrested. But the thought of how close we had come to being involved in his twisted scheme still haunts me. I'll never look at a free listing the same way again. To this day, I can't believe how close we came to becoming part of that sick game. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that not everything that's free is worth it. Some things have a price you can't even begin to imagine. It started like any normal day. It was the spring of 2020, and I was living in a small town just outside of Charleston, South Carolina, in a house I had inherited from my grandmother. The house was old, much older than me, probably over a century old, complete with creaky floors, a musty smell, and an attic filled with boxes of things from decades past. My grandmother was a collector, and over the years, she'd amassed a number of antiques. Some of them were valuable, others not so much, but they all had a certain charm. The kind of charm that could make you feel like you were walking through a museum every time you stepped inside. But when she passed away, I was left with more than just the house. I had boxes of old furniture, tarnished silverware, dusty paintings, and porcelain figurines. It was too much for me. I had no interest in keeping any of it, so I decided to sell most of the collection through Facebook Marketplace. I didn't think much of it, just another way to get rid of things I didn't need. I posted a listing for several pieces: a set of antique chairs, an old grandfather clock, some glass vases, and a beautiful, albeit strange, painting of a woman in a white dress. It was the only thing my grandmother had ever really cherished, and I figured it would fetch a decent price. The messages started rolling in right away, but one stood out. It was from a man named Henry, who said he was interested in the entire collection. He asked if he could come by the house and take a look at everything in person before making an offer. I agreed, figuring he'd just want to see the condition of the items. When he arrived, it was already getting late, around 7 p.m. He pulled up in a dark sedan that seemed a bit out of place for the quiet neighborhood. Henry himself was tall, older than me by at least 15 years, with thinning gray hair and a pale face that didn't look entirely healthy. He was polite, but something about the way he smiled didn't sit right with me. "Good evening," he said, his voice too smooth, too deliberate. "I've been looking for pieces just like these for years." We walked into the living room, and he immediately started inspecting the furniture, running his fingers over the wood, commenting on the craftsmanship. I had to admit my grandmother had taken good care of these things, but Henry seemed different. There was an intensity in his eyes, like he wasn't just looking at antique chairs and old paintings. He was studying them, memorizing them. He seemed particularly taken by the painting of the woman in the white dress. He stood in front of it for what felt like an eternity, his eyes glazed over, almost as if he was seeing something only he could see. "This one," he murmured, almost to himself. "This one truly belongs to me." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off as just a weird comment. After all, antique collectors can get attached to pieces they've been searching for, right? He moved from one item to the next, but now there was a new air of familiarity about him. Like he wasn't just a buyer anymore. He seemed like he belonged here, like the house was his. He glanced around the room, and I noticed something unsettling. He had subtly locked the door behind him when he entered. I didn't say anything at first, thinking I had imagined it, but it was hard to ignore the way he was acting. "You've done a wonderful job maintaining these," Henry said, his voice taking on a more insistent tone. "Even though they were mine." I froze. "What do you mean, they were yours?" Henry turned to look at me, his smile fading. He tilted his head as if confused by my question. "These antiques, of course," he said, his voice now taking on a cold, almost mechanical quality. "They've always belonged to me. You've taken such good care of them, though. I can tell you've kept them safe." I stepped back, suddenly uneasy. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice shaky. "These are just old things I inherited. They're mine now." But Henry wasn't listening. He was already walking through the house, moving from room to room. He touched the walls, the windows, the floors, as if he was reacquainting himself with everything. Then he paused by the staircase leading to the attic. "You know," he said quietly, "this house has a rich history, a very dark history." He turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. "You probably don't know this, but this house has been part of something far bigger than just your grandmother's collection." My blood ran cold. My grandmother had never mentioned anything about the house's history being anything but ordinary. What was he talking about? Henry continued, his voice lowering as if he was sharing a secret he had waited years to tell. "Decades ago, this house was the site of, well, let's call it a collection of sorts," he said. But it wasn't just antiques they were after. He glanced over at the painting of the woman in white. They used these pieces in rituals to bring the dead back, or maybe it was to bind them. I don't remember the details, but the antiques were always central. This house, these very walls, held the energy of those events. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was in a nightmare. "What do you mean, rituals? What are you talking about?" Henry smiled again, but this time it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, almost too knowing. "You'll understand soon enough," he said. "You see, the antiques weren't just decorations. They were tools. Tools for the people who lived here before you. Tools for rituals of power and death." I could hardly breathe. "You're scaring me," I said, my voice weak. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he replied smoothly. "I just want to make sure the collection is complete. After all, it's only right that it belongs with the original owner." His eyes flickered to the painting again. The woman in the white dress, it was almost as if he expected her to speak. I tried to take a step back, but Henry moved with surprising speed, blocking the door. He chuckled softly, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. "You can't leave," he said, his tone suddenly dark and dangerous. "You're part of the collection now." My mind raced as I realized the true horror of what was happening. Henry didn't care about the antiques. He wasn't interested in buying anything. He was here for the house, for the energy it held. And more terrifyingly, he believed it belonged to him. I turned to run, but Henry was already moving toward me, his eyes filled with a cold, sick certainty. I don't know how, but somehow I managed to break free, bolting out the door and into my car. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I called the police when I got to safety, but when they arrived, Henry was gone. The house was empty. The antiques were still there, but there was no trace of the man who had been so sure it all belonged to him. They never found him. The authorities searched the area and tried to track him down, but he disappeared without a trace. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that Henry will come back for the house one day. That maybe, somehow, he's still out there, waiting for the collection to be complete. Every time I look at the antiques in my living room, I remember the eerie calm in his eyes as he said, I was part of the collection now. It was a rough time for me. I was in my third year at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and money was tighter than ever. Between tuition, rent, books, and all the other college expenses, I was living on ramen and the occasional cheap pizza. My old apartment, a small, rundown unit in a building off Speedway Boulevard, was barely holding together. The place was a mess, and the landlord was a nightmare to deal with. I'd been looking for something more affordable for weeks, but nothing seemed to fit. That's when I found the listing on Craigslist. The ad was simple, but it immediately caught my eye. Luxurious 2-bedroom apartment for rent, $500 a month, move-in ready. The pictures showed a spacious modern unit with sleek furniture, granite countertops, and floor-to-ceiling windows. It looked too good to be true. I thought maybe there was some catch. Perhaps the unit rough neighborhood or needed some repairs. But when I saw the price, I couldn't help myself. $500 a month? That was a steal, even in Tucson. Most places around campus were going for over $1,000. I messaged the landlord, a guy named Greg, and we exchanged a few texts. He was friendly, but there was something about his responses that felt rushed. He said the apartment was still available, but he wanted to meet me at the property for a final walkthrough. We agreed to meet that night, around 10 p.m. It was late, but I was desperate. I figured I'd just take a quick look at the place and sign the lease if everything checked out. When I arrived, I found the apartment building tucked away at the end of a quiet street off Grant Road. It was a huge old brick building that looked like it had been around for decades. The lights were off, except for a single light near the entrance. I rang the doorbell and the door opened almost immediately. Standing in the doorway was Greg, the landlord. He was taller than I expected, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing a wrinkled button-up shirt and jeans. He smiled when he saw me. "Hey, thanks for coming by," he said. His voice was friendly, but there was a strange nervous energy to it. "I know it's late, but I just wanted to do one last walkthrough with you. We can get everything signed after that." I nodded, trying to ignore the odd feeling that was creeping up on me. Greg led me through the front door, and I was instantly impressed. The apartment was even more beautiful in person than in the photos. The hardwood floors gleamed in the soft light, and the furniture looked brand new. It felt luxurious, like something out of a magazine. He showed me around the living room and kitchen first, explaining how everything was brand new and state-of-the-art. We walked through the bedrooms, which were huge and had great views of the city. The place seemed perfect. But then Greg did something that made my stomach drop. He mentioned the basement. "Hey, just one thing before you go," he said. "There's a small issue with the pipes in the basement. I've been meaning to get it checked out, but I thought you might want to take a quick look at it." I thought it was odd. There was no mention of a basement in the listing, and it didn't seem like something that should be a priority at this stage. But Greg was insistent. "Don't worry," he said with a forced chuckle. "It's not a big deal, just a leak. You know how old buildings can be." My mind told me to just leave, but the apartment was so perfect and I needed a place to live. Plus, it was starting to feel like I was just overthinking things, so I agreed. "Sure, let's check it out." He led me down a narrow staircase to the basement, which was colder than the rest of the apartment. There was a strange, musty smell in the air, and the dim light overhead flickered as we descended. The basement was empty, except for a few old boxes and a large, stained mattress in the corner. But that's not what caught my attention. It was the chains. I froze as I saw them. Heavy metal chains bolted to the wall, rusted with age, but still very much intact. My heart started racing. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes were drawn to something else. Bloodstains. Dark, dried patches that were smeared across the concrete floor, leading to the mattress. Something was very wrong. Before I could say anything, Greg turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, like I said, nothing to worry about, just a small issue." He turned and walked toward the corner, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I wanted to get out of there. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, but as I stepped toward the stairs, I heard a low click behind me. I spun around to find Greg standing near the door, his face no longer friendly. He was smiling, but it was a twisted, predatory grin. He casually slid a bolt into place, locking the basement door. "You can't leave yet," Greg said, his voice almost a whisper. "We haven't finished the tour." My mind was racing now, and my body was in full-on panic mode. I turned toward the stairs, but Greg stepped forward, blocking the way. "You don't understand," he said, his voice calm now, almost too calm. "This place was meant for me. For us." I was completely paralyzed with fear. Something clicked inside me. My phone. I fumbled for it in my pocket, but Greg's eyes were already on me. He stepped closer, his smile widening. "Don't bother," he said. "No one's going to hear you." That's when I realized this wasn't just some weird rental scam. It wasn't a bad landlord. Greg wasn't even the real landlord. The door behind him had a real estate sign next to it, one of those "for rent" signs with a photo of the landlord. As I looked at it, my breath caught in my throat. The real landlord's face was there, but with the words "missing" written in bold red letters across the picture. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The man I was standing in front of wasn't the landlord. He was something far worse. He was a predator, using this fake listing to lure victims into the apartment. The real landlord had been killed, and Greg had been using his identity to stay hidden in plain sight. The chains, the bloodstains, they were part of his sick game. I knew I had to get out, but Greg wasn't about to let that happen. I lunged toward the stairs, pushing him aside, and bolted for the exit. But as I reached the front door, I heard him shout from behind me, "You can't escape. You're a part of this now." I didn't look back. I ran into the night, and I didn't stop until I found a police officer near the gas station down the street. They immediately called backup and returned to the apartment. But when they arrived, the place was abandoned. There was no sign of Greg, and the apartment was empty, like he'd never even been there. The authorities found the real landlord's body the next day, hidden in a crawl space under the basement. The place had been a trap all along. Greg had used the Craigslist listing to lure in people looking for a cheap place to live, and he'd been doing it for months. I was just one of his many victims. It took a long time for the authorities to catch him, but they eventually did. Turns out Greg wasn't his real name, and he had been on the run for years. He'd been responsible for several disappearances, all of which were connected to his sick, twisted collection of victims. He was hiding in plain sight using the fake real estate listings to cover his tracks. To this day, I can't even look at Craigslist the same way. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And sometimes the biggest traps are the ones you don't even see coming. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the middle of one of the most frustrating weeks of my life. I had just lost my job and the bills were starting to pile up. My car, an old 2007 Honda Civic, had been giving me trouble for months. It was barely running and needed more repairs than it was worth. So I made the decision to sell it. I listed it on Facebook Marketplace for $2,500, hoping to make a quick sale. It wasn't in the best condition, but it was a reliable car if you could get past the odd noises and the occasional sputtering engine. I wasn't expecting much, but almost immediately I started getting messages. Most of them were from lowballers or people who clearly didn't understand the value of a used car. But then, about a day later, I got a message from someone who seemed different. The message was polite, short, and to the point. "Hi, I'm interested in the Honda Civic you listed. I'm available to check it out tomorrow if it's still for sale." The name on the account was David, and his profile seemed legitimate. No red flags. His tone was respectful, and we quickly arranged a time for him to come by the next day. He said he'd be coming alone, which I thought was a bit unusual, but it didn't really raise any alarms. I figured he was just a no-nonsense kind of guy. The next afternoon, David showed up right on time. He was in his late 30s, wearing a black jacket and a pair of jeans. He looked normal enough, no strange behavior or anything that made me uneasy. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and said he'd like to take the car for a quick test drive. I agreed, figuring it was the usual thing to do when buying a used car. I hopped in the passenger seat and we pulled out of my driveway. We made small talk as we drove through my neighborhood. David was friendly enough, asking about the car's history and how long I'd owned it. Everything seemed completely normal. But then, just as we were about to turn onto a main road, David took a sudden left turn onto a street I didn't recognize. "Where are we going?" I asked, thinking maybe he just wanted to test the car on some empty streets. "Just a detour," he said, his tone a little too casual. I like to drive in quiet places. It didn't feel right, but I tried to shake it off. I told myself that maybe he knew a shortcut or was just trying to see how the car handled on different roads. But as we drove further into a more desolate part of town, I started to notice that the houses became sparse and the streets were nearly empty. We were driving deeper into an abandoned area on the outskirts of the city. "Hey, I think you've gone a little too far," I said, my voice shaky. "We should probably head back." David didn't respond at first, but then I noticed something unsettling. He locked the doors. I heard the familiar sound of the locks clicking into place. That was the first real sign that something was off, but I tried to stay calm. "David, what are you doing?" I asked again, my heart starting to race. He just looked over at me with a cold smile. "We're fine. Just keep driving." Before I could say anything else, David sped up. My stomach twisted into knots as the car picked up speed, and the familiar roadways I recognized disappeared into the distance. I looked out the window and realized we were driving on narrow, overgrown roads, far away from the nearest gas station or grocery store. The area looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Broken down buildings and abandoned homes lined the street. "David, this isn't funny anymore." Where are we going? I demanded, my voice rising in panic. David's smile faded, and for the first time, his face looked serious, almost too serious. He glanced at me briefly, then back at the road, before finally speaking. I'm not interested in the car, he said flatly. I just needed a way to get out of town. I blinked in confusion. What are you talking about? He glanced over at me again, his expression tight with tension. I'm not here to buy your car, man. I'm just using it to get away from someone dangerous, and now you're involved. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The sweat started to bead on my forehead. What are you talking about? Who are you running from? But before he could answer, I heard the unmistakable sound of another car engine revving up behind us. I turned to look in the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. There was a black SUV following us, tailing us closely. And there was another car behind that, a silver sedan, just as close. The headlights of both vehicles were glaring in our rearview mirror, and I could see them gaining on us. David's hands tightened on the wheel, and his jaw clenched. They're here. They've found me. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I had no idea who these people were, but I was trapped in a car with a man who clearly wasn't telling me the whole story, and now I was in the middle of whatever nightmare he had dragged me into. What do you mean? They found you? Who are they? I demanded, my voice shaking. David didn't answer. Instead, he slammed his foot on the gas, sending the car hurtling forward into the night. The two vehicles behind us were now right on our tail, and I could hear the engines roaring as they closed in. We were on narrow, twisting roads, but David wasn't slowing down. The trees and bushes whipped past us as the car swerved, narrowly avoiding obstacles. In the distance, I could make out the headlights of other vehicles, but I couldn't tell how many were following. I felt like I was part of some sick, twisted game. David didn't seem concerned about the cars behind us. Instead, he kept looking ahead, focused, determined, as if his life depended on this escape. And that's when it hit me. His life was depending on this. He wasn't trying to sell me the car or just get away. He was running from something much worse. These people weren't after the car, they were after him. I didn't know who they were, but I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't get out of this car, I might never get out at all. Please, I begged, gripping the door handle. Let me out. I don't want any part of this. I just want to go home. David didn't reply, but I saw a brief flash of something, regret maybe, or pity, before he slammed the brakes hard. The car jerked to a stop in the middle of the road, and I had no idea what was going on. Before I could react, the black SUV sped past us, just missing the front of the car. David slammed the gas pedal again, but now we were both stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way out. I had no choice. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open, ignoring the roar of the engine as I jumped out of the car. I ran as fast as I could into the dark, unfamiliar woods on the side of the road. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away from David and those cars chasing us. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and the sound of the cars chasing me echoed in my ears. I had no idea if David was going to follow me or if the people after him would find me too. I just kept running. By some miracle, I made it to a nearby farmhouse, where I knocked on the door and begged for help. The owners called the police, and I never saw David or the cars again. But I will never forget the fear in his eyes or the terror of being caught in a deadly chase that I had no part in. It turned out that David wasn't just running from anyone. He was running from a group of criminals he had crossed, and they had been hunting him for weeks. The police eventually caught them, but it was too late for some of their victims. From that night on, I've never trusted anyone who wants to take a test drive alone. And I've learned the hard way that sometimes a car sale is more than just a transaction. It can be a trap. I've been a police officer in Phoenix, Arizona for over 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange cases. But the one that still haunts me happened about 2 years ago. It all started with a routine call, something that seemed as ordinary as any other in our line of work. A woman named Lisa had gone missing. She was 28, a single mom who lived just outside the city in a quiet neighborhood. She had been working 2 jobs to make ends meet, And as far as we knew, she didn't have any known enemies or any history that would suggest she'd run off. Her family was frantic. They hadn't heard from her in almost 24 hours, which wasn't like her. Her phone had been turned off, and there was no sign of her at her apartment or anywhere around her usual spots. At first, we thought it might have been some kind of misunderstanding, a late night at work, maybe some miscommunication. But as time went on, the situation grew darker. Lisa wasn't the type to disappear without telling anyone, and then the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. We got a tip from a neighbor who had seen Lisa's car parked at a nearby shopping center the night she went missing. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to get us started. The surveillance footage from the area showed Lisa walking towards her car late at night, but there was something off about it. In the footage, a man stepped into the frame, walking up to her car. The two exchanged a few words, and then Lisa seemed to get into the car with him. The footage was grainy, but we could make out the man's face just enough to get a sketch artist to put something together. Lisa's family didn't recognize him, and neither did her friends. He was a stranger. A few days passed, and we couldn't track the guy down. But we did find out something that made everything a whole lot worse. Lisa had been communicating with him online. It turned out that she had been selling her old furniture on Craigslist to make some extra cash. The man she met that night had responded to one of her ads. At first, it seemed innocent enough. He had asked to meet at the shopping center to buy a few items, a couch and some old electronics. But as we dug deeper, we found something chilling. This wasn't just some random Craigslist buyer. No, this was a man who had been using online classifieds to lure people in. He wasn't looking for furniture. He was looking for victims. We put out a bulletin for the guy, and then we got the call. It came in late at night, just as I was heading home from my shift. The dispatcher told me they had found a car abandoned on a back road outside of town. I immediately recognized the vehicle. It was Lisa's. We got a team together and headed out to the location. When we arrived, the car was parked in a desolate area near an abandoned industrial complex. The whole place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The streets were empty, and there was a sense of stillness that sent a chill down my spine. We began to search the area, combing through the brush and the old warehouses. That's when I found her. Lisa's body was behind one of the warehouses. It was clear she had been there for some time. The way she was positioned, it didn't make sense. It wasn't just a random act of violence. No, this was calculated. She had been tied up, and it was obvious that whoever had done this had taken their time. They had left her in a place where no one would find her for days. I felt a knot in my stomach. This wasn't just a case of a missing person gone wrong. This was something darker, something far more sinister. We didn't have much to go on, but we had enough. The man who had abducted Lisa wasn't just a random Craigslist buyer. He was a predator, using the anonymity of the internet to find vulnerable targets. And once he had his victim, he wasn't just going to take their money or goods, he was going to take their lives. After weeks of investigation, we managed to track the guy down. His name was Mark, and he had been using fake profiles to lure women into meeting him. He had done this at least a dozen times before, with a pattern that was chillingly consistent. He would pose as a buyer, meet with his victims, and then force them into his car under the pretense of needing to go to another location. Once they were in, he would take them somewhere isolated where he could do whatever he wanted without being interrupted. We arrested him in a motel on the outskirts of the city. Mark didn't put up much of a fight. He was calm, eerily so. It was like he had done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly what to say. He claimed he didn't know why he'd done it, that it was just something he had to do. The whole thing made my skin crawl. When we finally brought him in, we found a collection of personal items from other women in his possession, old jewelry, clothes, and even photos. It was like he was building a twisted trophy case of his victims. Mark was arrested and charged with kidnapping, murder, and a series of other crimes. His trial was quick, and it wasn't long before he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the whole thing still haunts me. I've seen a lot of things in my time as a cop, but what Mark did wasn't something I could ever shake. He had used Craigslist, an everyday app that people trusted, to disguise his true intentions. It made me sick to my stomach to think about how many other women he might have targeted before Lisa. After that case, I made a promise to myself that I would never underestimate the dangers of the online world. It's easy to think that nothing bad will happen to you, especially when you're just selling some old furniture or looking for a good deal. But that's exactly what Mark counted on. If I could give anyone one piece of advice, it would be this: always be cautious. No one is ever as they seem online, and you never really know who you're dealing with until it's too late. Back in the late 90s, when the internet was still a wild frontier and Craigslist was just beginning to become the hub it is today, I was living in a small apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. I was fresh out of college, broke, and just trying to piece my life together. The internet was this new thing, and Craigslist had just launched, offering a way for people to sell their used stuff without going through the hassle of classified ads in newspapers. For a guy like me, it seemed like a godsend. I could sell old books, furniture, and anything else I no longer needed to make a little extra cash. At the time, I had an old exercise bike and some other workout gear cluttering up my living room. I hadn't used them in months, and they were taking up valuable space. So, I figured I'd list them on Craigslist to see if someone might want to take them off my hands. The listing was pretty straightforward. I described the equipment, took a couple of photos, and listed the price at $50 for everything. It seemed fair, considering the items were in decent shape, even though I hadn't used them in a while. I didn't expect much, but within a few hours I got a message from someone named Frank. He seemed friendly enough, just a guy looking for some inexpensive exercise equipment. He said he'd be happy to come pick everything up and offered to bring his own tools to help disassemble the larger pieces, which sounded reasonable to me. We agreed to meet the next day, around 3 p.m. Frank told me he'd be driving a white van and would arrive at my apartment to take everything away. I thought it sounded a little strange for someone to need tools to take apart a bike, but I didn't think much of it. After all, Craigslist was still a relatively new thing, and people were still figuring out the best way to handle these types of transactions. When Frank arrived, he seemed like a regular guy. He was in his late 30s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and had short, scruffy hair. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and smiled politely. "Nice to meet you," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "I brought my tools like I said I would. You mind if I go ahead and start taking things apart?" I figured it was a bit of over a simple transaction, but I shrugged it off. "Sure, go ahead. I just need the space." He started with the bike, which had a few screws on the base that could easily be removed. I sat on the couch in the living room while Frank worked. He seemed to be doing everything by the book, careful with his tools, taking things apart piece by piece. As the minutes passed, I started feeling more comfortable, but also a bit more curious. Something about Frank's manner was off. He wasn't rushing, but he was methodical in a way that made me uncomfortable. His movements were so precise, like he had done this before. "Hey," I said after a while, trying to break the silence. "I appreciate you being so careful with this stuff." Frank didn't answer immediately. He just kept working, his focus completely on the task at hand. I watched him for a second, then got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. As I passed through the hallway, I noticed Frank's tools laid out on the floor: a small wrench, a screwdriver, and a crowbar. The crowbar caught my attention for a second, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe he needed it to loosen a part of the bike's frame. When I returned to the living room, Frank was still focused on the equipment. "Almost done with this part," he said, still not looking at me. "Just a few more pieces to go." But then something changed. I don't know what made me feel it, but suddenly I became very aware of how quiet everything had become. Frank's calm demeanor had shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. The air in the room felt heavy, and I realized that Frank had positioned himself in a way that had blocked the exit. I couldn't walk past him without brushing up against him, and I was trapped in the corner of the room with no clear way out. It was then that I noticed something even more unsettling: the tools. Frank had been moving them around for the last few minutes, and now I could see that they weren't being used for disassembling the exercise equipment. They were being arranged, not for convenience, but with purpose. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Something was definitely off. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't going to be able to just walk out of this. I looked at Frank again. He was still working, but his hands were moving with a strange precision, his eyes flickering toward me every now and then. Then, as if he had been waiting for the right moment, Frank spoke. "You know, it's funny," he said, his voice casual but with an edge to it. "When I first saw your ad, I thought about how routine it seemed, just selling some old exercise equipment. But then I started reading through your listing more carefully, and I noticed something that stood out." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Frank turned to look at me, finally meeting my gaze for the first time. His eyes were cold, almost calculating. "It's the way you wrote about your schedule. You mentioned that you usually get home from work around 4 p.m. every day, and the fact that you work from home on Tuesdays, Thursdays, little details like that. You wouldn't believe how easy it is to track someone once you know their routine." I was speechless. My heart started pounding in my chest. What the hell was he talking about? "You see," Frank continued, taking a step closer to me, "I've been following your Craigslist activity for a while now. I knew when you'd be home, when you'd be alone. I knew the exact right time to come by." My stomach dropped. I realized then that I had made a huge mistake. In my eagerness to get rid of the equipment and make some quick cash, I had posted personal details that to me seemed harmless: my routine, my work schedule, the times I was available, the innocuous things we all share online without thinking twice. But Frank had been paying attention to everything. Before I could react, he moved toward me, slowly, deliberately. "You know, I've been really looking forward to this. You're the perfect target, really. So predictable, so easy." I felt my body freeze. Frank wasn't here to buy anything. He wasn't interested in the exercise equipment. I was the target. I had been the whole time. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was dealing with someone who had been watching me. He knew how I lived, where I went, when I was home. He had been planning this for weeks, and now I was trapped in my own apartment with him. Frank took a step closer, and I knew that if I didn't do something, I wouldn't get out of there alive. I acted fast. I lunged toward the door, pushing past him with all the strength I had left. Frank reached out to grab me. But I was already out the door, running down the hallway, yelling for help. I didn't stop until I burst into the parking lot and into the arms of a neighbor who had heard me screaming. The police were called, and Frank was arrested shortly after. Turns out, he had been using Craigslist to target people with predictable schedules, people who made the mistake of posting too much about their routines. His routine had been stalking and tracking his prey, and I was just one of his many victims. That was the last time I ever trusted Craigslist without being cautious. You never know who's reading your posts, and you never know what little detail might be the one thing that makes you a target. From that day on, I always thought twice before posting anything personal online, and I never listed anything for sale without taking precautions.